Pay close attention, because what is moving beneath the surface today is not the kind of energy that can be ignored, managed, or pushed aside. No matter how disciplined you believe you are, no matter how skilled you become at staying composed, there is something awakening within you that has reached the point where it can no longer remain hidden. On June 9th, the Sun in Gemini reaches an exact opposition to Black Moon Lilith in Sagittarius, and when this alignment locks into place, it creates a moment of revelation so powerful that many people will feel their entire inner world shifting without understanding why. What has been buried begins to rise. What has been silenced begins to speak. What has been locked away behind years of adaptation, compromise, and self-censorship starts pressing against the walls that have contained it for far too long. Most people will experience this energy without realizing what is happening. They will notice a growing discomfort they cannot explain. They will wake up feeling unusually irritated. Conversations that once seemed harmless will suddenly feel unbearable. Situations they tolerated for months or even years will begin to feel restrictive, suffocating, and strangely impossible to continue. Their emotions will appear larger than usual. Their patience will seem shorter. Their reactions will surprise even themselves. Yet very few will recognize the true source of the pressure building inside them. You are different because you are paying attention. If over the last several days you have felt a strange agitation moving through your system, if there has been a persistent feeling that something inside you wants change, even though you cannot fully define what that change is, then you are already sensing the approach of this transit. Perhaps you have noticed yourself questioning choices you once felt certain about. Perhaps old desires are resurfacing unexpectedly. Perhaps there is a growing awareness that some part of your life no longer reflects who you truly are. These are not random emotional fluctuations. They are signs that something much deeper is preparing to emerge. To understand why this moment carries such enormous significance, you have to understand the forces involved. The Sun represents the identity you consciously recognize. It symbolizes your awareness, your sense of self, your personal narrative, and the image you present to the world. It is the part of you that knows how to function within society. It is the version of yourself that has learned what is acceptable, what is rewarded, and what allows you to move through life with the least resistance. The Sun illuminates what you openly claim as yours. Black Moon Lilith operates very differently. Lilith represents the aspects of yourself that were pushed into the shadows. She governs the instincts that were judged, the desires that were criticized, the emotions that felt unsafe to express, and the truths that seemed too dangerous to reveal. She carries the memory of every time you learned that being fully yourself came with consequences. Over time, many people begin cutting away pieces of themselves in order to gain approval, avoid rejection, or maintain stability. Those rejected pieces do not disappear. They remain alive beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when they can finally return. Today, that moment arrives. As the Sun directly opposes Lilith, your conscious awareness is forced to look directly at what has been hidden. Imagine standing in a room that has remained dark for years, and suddenly every light switches on at once. Nothing can remain concealed. Every neglected corner becomes visible. Every ignored truth demands recognition. The desires you convinced yourself no longer mattered return to your awareness. The emotions you buried begin demanding space. The parts of yourself you abandoned in order to fit into someone else's expectations start knocking on the door with undeniable force. In astrology, an opposition is one of the most demanding aspects because it creates tension between two opposing points. It does not allow easy escape. It does not offer the comfort of choosing one side while rejecting the other. Instead, it requires integration. It asks you to hold two realities at the same time. The version of yourself that learned how to survive, and the version of yourself that longs to be free, must finally meet each other. This process can feel uncomfortable because it exposes contradictions you may have spent years avoiding. That growing tension you have been carrying recently is not imaginary. The frustration that seems to appear from nowhere, the sudden impatience with circumstances that once felt manageable, the increasing inability to tolerate pretending, all of it reflects this opposition-building momentum inside your psychological landscape. For many people, it will feel as though a pressure valve has been slowly tightening for days. Today, that pressure reaches a turning point. The voice that has remained silent becomes impossible to ignore. Yet what makes this day truly remarkable is that the cosmos is not delivering this confrontation in isolation. There is another extraordinary event unfolding alongside it, and its timing is almost impossible to overlook. Just hours before the Sun and Lilith reach their exact opposition, Venus and Jupiter unite in an exact conjunction in Cancer. Venus, the planet associated with love, connection, beauty, and emotional harmony, joins Jupiter, the planet of expansion, blessings, wisdom, and abundance. Together they meet in Cancer, the sign most deeply connected to emotional security, nurturing, belonging, and protection. This conjunction occurs only once every 12 years in Cancer, making it one of the most significant emotional support systems available within the current astrological landscape. The symbolism is profound. At the exact moment when hidden truths are preparing to surface, the universe simultaneously creates an environment capable of holding those truths with compassion rather than judgment. This matters because confronting your shadow is rarely comfortable. Looking directly at the parts of yourself that were rejected can feel overwhelming. Under different circumstances, a Sun opposite Lilith transit might push people into extreme reactions. It could trigger impulsive decisions, emotional outbursts, broken relationships, or actions driven purely by accumulated frustration. When long suppressed truths erupt without support, the experience can become chaotic. But that is not the atmosphere surrounding this particular transit. Venus and Jupiter in Cancer provide something invaluable. They create emotional shelter. They offer a reminder that healing does not require self-destruction. They encourage understanding where there could have been shame, compassion where there could have been fear, and acceptance where there could have been rejection. It is as though the universe understands the intensity of what is being revealed and places a protective hand on your shoulder before asking you to face it. That is why today is not simply about exposure. It is about recognition. It is about seeing yourself more clearly than you have in a very long time. Something hidden is stepping into the light, and for the first time, you may discover that the very part of yourself you feared most is actually the key to becoming whole. And what happens once that realization fully lands is where this story becomes even more powerful. What makes this moment so extraordinary is not simply that hidden truths are surfacing. It is that the cosmos has arranged the conditions for those truths to emerge without immediately threatening your sense of safety. At the exact time when the Sun in Gemini opposes Black Moon Lilith in Sagittarius, Venus and Jupiter remain joined in Cancer, creating an emotional atmosphere unlike anything most people experience very often. Instead of standing alone as old fears rise to the surface, you are being surrounded by an energy that encourages acceptance, nourishment, and trust. Venus, the force of love, connection, and value, joins Jupiter, the force of expansion, abundance, and blessing, within Cancer, the sign most deeply associated with emotional protection, belonging, and genuine care. The result is a rare feeling that you no longer have to choose between authenticity and security. For many people, the deepest fear is not rejection itself. It is the belief that if they reveal who they truly are, they will lose everything that matters. They fear that honesty will cost them love. They fear that self-expression will destroy stability. They fear that allowing their full nature to emerge will push others away. Yet the remarkable opportunity hidden inside today's alignment is the possibility that the opposite may be true. The very things you have spent years concealing may be the exact qualities that allow deeper connection to form. The parts of yourself that seem dangerous to reveal may be the parts others have been waiting to see. Beneath the turbulence of this transit exists an invitation to stop negotiating with your own soul. To understand why this feels so intense, we need to look deeper into what Black Moon Lilith is activating as she moves through Sagittarius. This is not merely about rebellion or independence. It reaches into something far older and far more personal. Sagittarius governs belief systems, personal truth, philosophy, spiritual exploration, and the search for meaning beyond accepted limitations. When Lilith travels through this territory, she exposes wounds connected to intellectual freedom and the right to define reality for yourself. She awakens what many astrologers describe as the heretic wound. This wound often operates beneath conscious awareness. It is not always connected to one obvious event. Instead, it can exist as a collection of experiences accumulated over years. Somewhere within your psychological history exists a memory of what happened when you questioned something you were expected to accept. Perhaps as a child you asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. Perhaps your perspective challenged family expectations. Perhaps you expressed beliefs that differed from those around you and discovered that disagreement carried consequences. Maybe the criticism was direct. Maybe it arrived through ridicule, rejection, embarrassment, or subtle emotional withdrawal. Whatever form it took, the message was often the same. Stay within acceptable boundaries. Think what everyone else thinks. Do not wander too far beyond the approved map. Over time, many people adapt by editing themselves. They become skilled at monitoring their own thoughts before expressing them. They learn how to predict what will be accepted and what will be challenged. They become experts at presenting a version of themselves that minimizes conflict. Little by little, they begin abandoning parts of their natural curiosity. They stop asking certain questions. They stop exploring certain ideas. They stop expressing certain perspectives. Not because those perspectives disappeared, but because safety became more important than authenticity. Since December of 2025, Lilith's movement through Sagittarius has been quietly dismantling this conditioning. The process has not always been obvious. It has appeared as restlessness, dissatisfaction, frustration, and an increasing inability to ignore inner contradictions. It has shown up as a growing awareness that certain beliefs no longer fit. It has manifested as a desire for greater freedom, greater honesty, and greater alignment between what you think privately and what you express publicly. Now, with the Sun in Gemini casting direct awareness onto this process, everything intensifies. The hidden tension becomes visible. The internal conflict becomes impossible to overlook. The psychological prison, built from years of self-censorship, begins to crack. What once remained buried behind politeness, compliance, and strategic silence starts demanding recognition. This is why the emotional energy surrounding today may feel almost overwhelming. It is not merely frustration. It is the realization that an important part of yourself has spent too long waiting for permission to exist. And this brings us to one of the most significant desires emerging from today's transit. It is not a desire for conflict. It is not a desire to prove yourself superior. It is not even a desire to be right. It is something much deeper. It is the refusal to continue diminishing your own mind. For many people, this pattern has existed for years. They learn to soften their opinions before speaking. They learn to disguise their intelligence in environments where curiosity threatened others. They learn to suppress insights that might create discomfort. They learn to present safer versions of their ideas rather than risking disapproval. Sometimes this adaptation became so automatic that it felt normal. It felt mature. It felt responsible. It felt like wisdom. But under the Sun, opposite Lilith, another truth becomes visible. Much of that silence was never wisdom at all. It was protection. Protection from criticism. Protection from exclusion. Protection from being labeled difficult, intense, unconventional, or challenging. Protection from reopening the old wound that taught you it was dangerous to think independently. As awareness increases today, tolerance for borrowed beliefs begins to disappear. You may find yourself suddenly exhausted by conversations that require you to pretend agreement. You may notice an unusual sensitivity to half-truths or intellectual dishonesty. Ideas you once accepted without question may begin demanding closer examination. Perspectives that no longer resonate may feel impossible to maintain. This reaction is not random. It is the psyche attempting to restore integrity. There comes a moment in personal evolution when continuing to betray your own understanding becomes more painful than facing disapproval. That threshold is what many people are approaching now. The emotional discomfort is not punishment. It is evidence that your internal compass is becoming stronger than external pressure. As this process unfolds, something powerful begins returning to you. Not arrogance, not defiance for its own sake, not rebellion driven by anger. What returns is ownership. Ownership of your perceptions, ownership of your questions, ownership of your search for truth. You begin remembering that your mind does not belong to consensus. Your beliefs do not require universal approval. Your curiosity is not a flaw that needs correction. Your perspective is not something that must constantly be negotiated in exchange for acceptance. And once this realization fully arrives, something irreversible happens. The person who spent years shrinking to fit inside other people's expectations begins to disappear. In their place emerges someone willing to explore, question, discover, and speak from genuine conviction. Not because they seek conflict, but because they can no longer tolerate abandoning themselves. That is the deeper liberation hidden inside today's opposition. The door that has been locked for so long begins to open. And once you experience what it feels like to think freely again, closing that door becomes almost impossible. Once this awakening begins, there is no comfortable middle ground left to retreat into. That is the nature of Black Moon Lilith. She is not interested in partial freedom. She is not concerned with maintaining appearances. She does not sit at the table bargaining away pieces of her truth in exchange for approval. Her energy would rather stand completely alone beneath an open sky than remain trapped inside a beautiful prison built from compromise. And as the Sun in Gemini continues its exact opposition to Lilith in Sagittarius on June 9th, that same force begins moving through your own emotional landscape with undeniable intensity. The next truth, emerging from beneath the surface, reaches directly into one of the deepest fears carried by the human heart. It is not about success. It is not about recognition. It is not even about purpose. It is about love. More specifically, it is about the longing to be loved without constantly managing how you are perceived. Take a moment and look honestly at your relationships. Not just romantic relationships, but friendships, family dynamics, professional connections, every place where human interaction exists. How much of your daily emotional energy is spent monitoring yourself before others can judge you? How often do you filter your reactions? How often do you soften your opinions? How often do you minimize your excitement, suppress your sadness, hide your frustration, disguise your passion, or dilute your intensity before allowing another person to see it? Most people begin learning this pattern very early in life. At some point, many discover that certain emotions receive approval while others receive criticism. Passion becomes too much. Anger becomes unacceptable. Vulnerability becomes weakness. Ambition becomes selfishness. Sensitivity becomes a burden. Depth becomes intimidating. Gradually, a subtle adaptation takes place. A new version of the self is constructed. This version knows exactly how much emotion to display. It knows how to remain agreeable. It knows how to appear stable. It knows how to avoid making others uncomfortable. It becomes skilled at maintaining connection by withholding authenticity. Over time, that performance can become so familiar that people stop noticing they're doing it. They begin believing that the role itself is who they are. But beneath the role, something remains restless. Because no matter how successful the performance becomes, a quiet awareness lingers in the background, a feeling that the person receiving love is not entirely real, a suspicion that the affection being offered is directed toward the carefully managed image rather than the full human being underneath it. This is where the Sun opposite Lilith transit becomes so emotionally significant. The opposition forces awareness onto the distance between who you are and who you've been presenting. Suddenly, maintaining the performance feels exhausting. The emotional armor that once felt protective begins feeling restrictive. The mask that once created safety begins feeling suffocating. And what rises beneath it is not merely a desire for attention. It is a profound need to experience connection without self-abandonment. A powerful emotional hunger begins surfacing now. Not a hunger for validation, not a hunger for admiration, a hunger to be fully seen, to be seen with your contradictions, to be seen with your flaws, to be seen with your intensity, to be seen with the complicated emotions you usually hide, to be seen with the parts of yourself that are passionate, possessive, imperfect, messy, ambitious, jealous, deeply feeling, fiercely loyal, occasionally unreasonable, and undeniably human. What is emerging under this transit is the realization that real intimacy cannot exist where authenticity is absent. The need to earn love through constant self-editing starts losing its grip. The idea that acceptance must be purchased through emotional obedience begins falling apart. And this can feel terrifying because the old fear immediately appears. What if people leave? What if they see everything and decide it is too much? What if authenticity costs connection? Yet one of the most surprising outcomes of this transit is that exposure does not always create separation. In fact, many relationships become stronger precisely because the performance ends. Something extraordinary happens when one person finally stops pretending. The emotional tension in the relationship often dissolves. Walls begin to lower. Conversations become more honest. The other person no longer has to interact with a carefully polished version of you. They are finally given access to the living, breathing human being underneath. And in many cases, they respond by becoming more authentic themselves. That is why this alignment can become a turning point rather than a breaking point. It reveals that genuine connection is often impossible until the mask disappears. For some of you, June 9th may become the day you understand that your worth was never dependent on becoming smaller. Your value was never tied to being easier to handle. Your lovability was never conditional upon suppressing the very qualities that make you unique. And once that understanding settles into your heart, another powerful realization begins rising immediately behind it. This third awakening is perhaps the most disruptive of all. It is the impulse that changes environments, the impulse that changes circumstances, the impulse that refuses to remain where life has become spiritually poisonous. There is a powerful symbolic image associated with the zodiacal degree occupied by Lilith during this transit. It describes pelicans abandoning a habitat that has become contaminated. The environment has deteriorated slowly. Toxicity has accumulated over time. Neglect has transformed what was once supportive into something harmful. The important detail is this. The pelicans do not remain. They do not hold meetings about the problem. They do not spend years hoping conditions improve. They do not sacrifice themselves in an effort to prove resilience. They recognize that survival requires movement. And they leave. That image mirrors what many souls are experiencing under today's alignment, because there are situations in life where endurance eventually stops being a virtue. There are careers that drain vitality faster than they provide security. There are living environments that slowly suffocate growth. There are relational dynamics that consume energy through constant compromise. There are circumstances that require such ongoing self-betrayal that remaining inside them becomes more damaging than departing. Yet many people continue enduring. They call it responsibility. They call it patience. They call it strength. They convince themselves that surviving discomfort proves maturity. And year after year they remain where their spirit quietly deteriorates. The sun, opposite Lilith, does something uncomfortable. It exposes the true cost. It shines light on everything sacrificed in exchange for stability. It reveals how much energy has been spent maintaining situations that no longer nourish life. It forces an honest accounting. The emotional numbness, the lost enthusiasm, the abandoned dreams, the shrinking sense of possibility, the gradual erosion of joy, all of it becomes visible. And when that visibility arrives, another desire breaks free from its chains. The desire is not reckless, it is not impulsive, it is not rooted in destruction, it is rooted in survival. It is the soul's refusal to continue living in an environment that demands its disappearance. For some people, this realization will arrive quietly. For others, it will hit with startling clarity. But however it appears, the message remains the same. There are places, situations, and chapters of life that can no longer accompany you into the person you are becoming. And once that truth is fully seen, pretending otherwise becomes almost impossible. The question that follows is not whether the awakening has happened. The question is what you will do now that you can finally see it. What is unfolding now is far more significant than a simple adjustment in perspective. This is not a gradual transition where one version of your life gently hands the reins to another. It is a confrontation between who you have become in order to survive and who you were always meant to be beneath the conditioning. The sun opposing Black Moon, Lilith, on June 9th, creates a moment when the distance between those two versions becomes impossible to ignore. Suddenly, the cost of remaining where you are feels heavier than the uncertainty of stepping into unfamiliar territory. Many people will not understand this process if they witness it from the outside. They will see someone questioning long-established patterns. They will see someone refusing to continue accepting circumstances that once seemed tolerable. They will see someone expressing truths that have remained hidden for years. And because they cannot feel what is happening inside your soul, they may label the transformation as impulsive, irrational, or reckless. But what appears impulsive from the outside often looks very different from within. From the inside, it feels like reaching the point where compromise has become unbearable. It feels like recognizing that comfort and fulfillment are not always the same thing. It feels like understanding that a life built around suppression eventually becomes its own form of confinement. That is the deeper message emerging through Lilith. She does not inspire endless negotiation with situations that require self-betrayal. She does not encourage people to spend years asking permission to exist authentically. Her energy pushes toward liberation, toward truth, toward the recovery of whatever has been sacrificed in exchange for approval or security. Not everyone will make dramatic changes immediately. Not everyone will walk away from old circumstances overnight. Yet something equally important happens under this transit. Awareness arrives. And once awareness arrives, it cannot easily be reversed. There is a profound psychological truth at work here. Human beings can tolerate almost anything when they remain unconscious of the cost. But the moment they clearly see the price they have been paying, everything changes. What was once invisible becomes impossible to ignore. What once felt normal begins to feel restrictive. What once felt permanent suddenly appears optional. This is why June 9th carries such significance. The realization itself becomes the turning point. The moment you truly recognize where your spirit has been shrinking, where your truth has been suppressed, where your needs have been ignored, the old structure begins losing power over you. Yet liberation is only the first stage. The universe immediately follows revelation with examination. This is where the next important astrological development enters the story. Within hours of the Sun opposite Lilith opposition, Mercury in Cancer forms a square to Saturn in Aries. The timing is remarkable. Mercury governs thought, perception, communication, reasoning, and the way the mind processes experience. Saturn represents structure, responsibility, boundaries, limitations, and reality testing. When these two forces clash through a square, the result often feels like friction between inspiration and practicality. This means that after the emotional breakthrough of June 9th, another phase begins. Questions arise. Doubt appears. The analytical mind starts reviewing everything that happened. You may wake up the following day wondering whether your emotions exaggerated the situation. You may question whether the truths that surfaced were completely accurate. You may find yourself replaying conversations, reconsidering decisions, or examining your reactions through a more critical lens. Communication may feel heavier than usual. Finding the right words may become unexpectedly difficult. Thoughts that felt crystal clear during the emotional breakthrough may suddenly seem harder to organize. Some people interpret this shift as evidence that they were mistaken. But that interpretation misses the deeper purpose of Saturn. Saturn is not attempting to invalidate your revelation. Saturn is attempting to strengthen it. Without structure, even the most profound realization can dissolve into temporary emotion. Without discipline, truth remains inspiration rather than transformation. Without practical application, awakening becomes a brief experience rather than a lasting change. The friction created by Mercury square Saturn serves an important function. It forces you to translate insight into reality. It asks difficult questions. It requires clarity. It demands responsibility. The wild truth that emerged under Lilith must now become something tangible. A decision, a boundary, a conversation, a commitment, a new direction. Something capable of surviving beyond the intensity of the moment. So when doubt appears, do not assume it means failure. When resistance emerges, do not assume it means retreat. Instead, recognize that pressure is often the process through which authenticity gains stability. The breakthrough was the spark. Saturn helps build the foundation that allows the fire to keep burning. And the story does not end there. The energetic impact of June 9th extends far beyond a single day. The entire month becomes part of the unfolding transformation. On June 14th, a new moon arrives in Gemini. New moons symbolize beginnings, intentions, and fresh cycles. After the revelations of the Sun-Lilith opposition, this new moon functions like fertile ground. The truths that surface now become seeds. What was previously emotional insight becomes conscious direction. The confusion begins clearing. The internal conflict begins organizing itself. New possibilities emerge that reflect your authentic identity rather than the version of yourself created to satisfy expectations. Opportunities, conversations, relationships, and pathways begin aligning with the truth that has finally been acknowledged. Then another important chapter begins on June 19th, when Chiron, often called the wounded healer, moves into Taurus. This marks the beginning of a 7-year healing cycle centered around themes of self-worth, material security, physical well-being, and personal value. The significance of this shift cannot be overstated. The freedom activated under Lilith is not meant to remain abstract. It is meant to become embodied. It is meant to influence how you live, how you earn, how you care for yourself, how you define value, how you create stability without sacrificing authenticity. Chiron in Taurus supports the process of building a life capable of sustaining the truth that has emerged. And finally, the month reaches another major turning point as Jupiter enters Leo on June 30th. Jupiter expands whatever it touches. Leo governs visibility, creativity, confidence, self-expression, and personal radiance. The truth that first emerged as a whisper becomes something larger. The courage that appeared during the Sun-Lilith opposition gains momentum. The authenticity that began as a private realization becomes increasingly visible in the outer world. What started as an internal awakening evolves into a new way of living, a new relationship with yourself, a new relationship with others, a new relationship with possibility. When viewed from the beginning of the month, June 9th may appear like a single explosive event. But when viewed from the end of the month, it reveals itself as the opening chapter of a much larger transformation. And that is why this day matters. Not because it is comfortable, not because it provides certainty, not because it hands you a complete roadmap. It matters because it interrupts the patterns that have kept you disconnected from yourself. The discomfort is not the problem. The years spent pretending were. The exhaustion came from suppressing what needed expression. The pain came from abandoning what needed acknowledgement. The tension came from living too far away from your own truth. Today, the universe draws a line. It asks for honesty, not perfection, not complete understanding, just honesty. The three forces emerging through this transit, the reclaiming of your independent mind, the longing for authentic love, and the refusal to remain in environments that diminish your spirit, are not obstacles. They are signals. They are evidence that something healthy is awakening. And standing beside all of it is the exact conjunction of Venus and Jupiter in Cancer, offering emotional nourishment, protection, support, and the reminder that growth does not have to happen alone. The message is simple. Trust what is surfacing. Allow the truth to emerge. Stop treating your authenticity as something dangerous, because the self that has been fighting to reach the surface is not your enemy. It is not the part that threatens your future. It is the part that has been trying to guide you toward it all along. And perhaps the greatest realization hidden inside this entire transit is that the person waiting on the other side of this awakening is not someone new at all. It is the version of you that existed before fear convinced you to become someone else. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on what surfaced while listening. Share your thoughts and experiences below, because every journey through transformation carries lessons that may help someone else. Thank you for spending this time here. Your presence and support mean more than you know. Stay curious, stay open to what is unfolding, and until next time, take care of yourself and continue exploring the deeper truths that shape your path.